Okay, we're good to go.
Great. All right. In that case, welcome everyone to the March occurrence of the Denver Department of Transportation Infrastructure Advisory Board meeting. We'll kick off with our typical welcome, roll call, and approval ratification of the prior month's meeting minutes. Wondering, Alan, if you have the sheet up needed for roll call. Are you ready to go there, or should we start with the meeting minutes?
I do. I can roll, and I've been kind of taking track of who I can see here that's already here, just to speed it up a little bit. Joni, but I haven't looked at everyone's names on here. Joni Allen. Joni, are you here?
Johnny
Nope.
is not here. He sent me an email that he will be absent.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Amy Contreras. Paul Gonzer. I don't know if Paul is here yet. I didn't see him. Christopher Johnson.
I am here.
Great, thank you, Christopher. And by the way, reminder, if you don't mind changing your names with your full name as well as what district or who you might be representing as mayoral appointee. Gary Johnson. Great. Jamie Lewis.
Present.
Thanks, Jamie. See you now. And Eileen, I saw you messaging us saying you're having microphone problems, but glad you are here. Thank you for being all smiles. And Julie. And Tangier. Great, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think that meets quorum, if I'm not mistaken.
Look, Alan, I'm wondering, I see Gary Johnson is logged on. Might have just had a mute issue. Wondering if you'd noted him as present.
Great, I did not. That would be 12.
Did you get me?
I did. I saw, if I didn't call your name, I saw that you were here, so I just marked you as an X.
Okay.
And I saw Kurt as well. Kurt looks like is also having mic problems, but I've got you here. If I didn't call your name, I've already marked you down as here. So, yep.
All right, great. We can kick off then with an approval of last month's February's meeting minutes. Could I have someone make the motion and get a second?
Just motion.
Okay. And a second.
Second.
All right, thank you, Joe. With that, please raise your hand if you are in favor of approving last month's meeting minutes. And I think we're short on some hands for folks that are on phones, unfortunately, or at least these web hands, I guess. And with that, let's take any nays. Give a moment for folks to drop hands. All right, well, with quorum and preponderance voting in favor, February meeting minutes are approved. We've now finished roll call and February meeting minutes. For those watching, before we move into the next segments of our agenda, I will review briefly what we're looking forward to today. We're going to start off with public comment for any of those who have signed up, which Namita can share with us in a moment. Typically, from there, we would receive our report from DOTI leadership. But per the request of Councilwoman Ortega, just from a scheduling, for scheduling reasons, we'll actually move straight into a discussion of a railway safety study that Councilwoman Debbie Ortega has been pursuing with assistance from CPD and the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. We will then move back to that report from DOTI leadership. We'll get a brief updates on the sidewalks ordinance as it passed last year, some ensuing progress on modifications to that ordinance and its implementation. We'll resolve another large chunk of time to discuss next steps for the 2024 Department of Transportation Infrastructure budget process and how we will be involved and how the public can be involved. We've got a bit of time for committee report outs from one or both of our committees, and we'll conclude with a review of our action items list from the prior meeting and add anything to that action items list from this meeting. So with that, Nanita, wondering if we have any public commenters this evening.
No one has signed up for public comment.
Okay. So we've moved through the very first sections of this agenda very quickly then. We're only at 4:08. We'd held 4:15 for Councilwoman Ortega to talk about the railway safety study. I don't see anyone logged on her behalf yet. Do you know if she or anyone else are in the audience and need to be brought forward, or if we should move to another topic first?
I haven't seen, but I sent her a link. She responded. She got it, but since then I haven't heard anything back from her.
Okay, and no members of the audience that would appear to be her or a member of her team.
It looks like, Jonathan, sorry to interrupt. We did have one person in the attendee list that raised their hand that appears to maybe want to do public comment, but I'm not sure. Matt Charlie is the person that listed.
Okay.
Let me move. Matt, I now promote you to the panelist. Let me know if you're in.
I think Matt is in.
I am in now. You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I did sign up for public comment about a month ago, so not sure if something was lost in translation. So I appreciate having the audience, if that still works for the agenda.
Yeah, sounds great. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. I've been in touch with Juan Garza with DOTI, so I want to first and foremost just state how much of a wonderful person he's been in terms of my intent to resolve this problem. I live in the southwest corner of Virginia Village. 1970 South Dexter is my home address, and that kind of butts up to a commercial residential mixed use with 3 different adult rehabilitation centers. And there is a significant transportation right-of-way parking issue that is sort of the residents have had to absorb based on those 3 properties. Juan's been very facilitatory in terms of understanding the issues, making recommendations, working with the right-of-way to increase enforcement on my residential street. But really, it's effectively, I think, a larger issue than just enforcement. I think it's frankly needs to be reviewed at like a zoning level, certainly a signage level, which Juan has given me some indication that has to go through various different approval processes and take some amount of time, and there's lag times involved in that as well. District 6 Councilman Paul Cashman has heard me out on this front. His office has been in close contact. And so I feel like I've been heard, but I certainly wanted to join today's monthly meeting to make that more broadly aware for the advisory organization within DOTI, and to maybe workshop some different ideas of how we can solve this issue that's been going on now for close to 2 years since I've owned this property in Virginia Village.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm curious, just for my clarification, I'm sorry if I missed this during your intro at the beginning. You said that there's been, I think, a right-of-way and parking issue. I think I'm confused as to understanding what it is. Is it that there's signage suggesting it's a no parking zone and people are parking anyway? I suppose I don't understand what the situation is.
Sure, I can be a little more clear about that, Jonathan. So the properties themselves, 3 of which, it's Rowan, Brookshire, and Amberwood Court. They're all 3 were under the ownership group of Vivid, which is a medical ownership group of some kind up until recently, about mid-Feb, about a month ago. 2 of them were acquired by a separate medical company. But the parking issue is basically spillover for employees, guests, residents, and the like, of which there's just not proper zoning whatsoever for the accommodations necessary for those 3 properties. And unfortunately, that just carries over into all the residents. We have, in my case, and a lot of other of my fellow residents here, neighbors, we have garages in the back part of our property, which have access through a driveway that kind of sits behind our homes. And so a lot of those spillover parking issues affect our ability to freely enter and exit our home residence, frankly. And this has been, for one example, my wife was 36 weeks pregnant here about a year and change ago. We were on our way to our final appointment with the OBGYN. We couldn't leave our home to make it to that appointment because of a car blocking our driveway from a guest or employee of one of the 3 properties in question here. So that's one kind of dramatic example, but frankly, on a daily occurrence, the 5-foot ordinance parking from a private driveway is broken. These are 4-hour parking restriction on this particular section of the residential street that is never enforced, frankly, as well as various other different kind of right-of-way issues that all residents incur on a daily or weekly basis.
Yeah, understood. So it's not just folks parking in typical street parking. They're blocking driveways, they're blocking alley access, et cetera.
Yeah, no alleys in this particular section of Virginia Village, but general same issues. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions from others on the line for Matt here? Sounds like no. Okay, Matt, we'll take this down and add it onto our actions list to discuss where we'll go next with this at the end of the meeting.
Appreciate
it.
Thanks for hearing me out.
All right. And Anita, now with that additional time pass, are we seeing anyone from Councilman Ortega's office on the line to be promoted?
Jonathan, I'm happy to do the executive update if you want to buy some time.
No, for sure. Yeah. I just wanted to see if perhaps that situation would change before we hop in. Sounds like possibly no. So yeah, if we can just move forward with the executive update.
All right. Good afternoon, Advisory Board. Good to see y'all. Again, Nick Williams, DOTI Chief of Staff, Deputy Manager on this. Going to provide a few updates, some good news. DOTI received a little over $500,000 in federal US DOT funding. Anita, I think you might still have your camera hot, or your microphone is still on. We received $576,000 in federal funding. This is Safer Streets for All. This was one of the newer initiatives contained in this most recent broad transportation infrastructure bill. This is going to fund 9 road safety audits throughout the city. And what I will do for a little bit more information, I'm going to share a link to our press release that gives you a little bit more information about what we will be doing under the grant, and then gives you specifics on the location. But regardless, we were very excited to receive that grant. Also, everyone's favorite time of the year, it is pothole season. If you watch the news, you may have seen the mayor did a press conference here, I think it was last week or week before last, just reminding folks that a big way to help get our potholes filled in is when residents report them to 311. And typically, if not almost always, those potholes will be filled in 48 hours. So tell your friends if they see potholes, be sure to send it in through 311 and make sure we get those fixed and make sure we've got safe and smooth infrastructure out there. And then finally, update, Denver Moves Everyone. I know this group received a number of presentations on this. This is our city's long-range plan for transportation infrastructure, basically kind of here's our game plan out to 2050 on there. It is finally wrapping up after a lot of hard work, a lot of contribution from this group, a lot of public interaction on that. Final comments were received from the public on March 3rd, and the team is now finalizing the report and will be expect to be releasing the final report here in spring. And not to get ahead of our presentations today, but the expectation is that you will see elements that were identified there and priorities that were identified in that plan into our 2024 budget process, which, as Earl's going to talk about later, has already begun. It is now budget high season on there. So just some high points I wanted to share. I see the councilwoman has joined us here, so happy to answer any questions or cede the floor.
Alan, question.
Yeah, one quick question about Nick. It looks like the standards for compost are changing a little bit. Is that true? No more paper in the compost? Is it just going to yard waste and food scraps?
I had not heard that. Let me double check that though.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Nick, this is Michelle. Yes, it is.
Okay. Yes, it is.
As of April 1st, you'll only put in food and yard and tree and anything from the yard in your compost bin. No more cartons, no more stained pizza cartons, anything like that.
Thanks, Michelle.
Sure.
Do you want to clarify for those who might not have received that notification by email? It was also very clear that compostable bags generally are not accepted. It appears then, and I'll follow up on this to make sure it's true. It appears that the compostable bags that do come with the compost bin, the small in-house compost bin, that specific brand have been approved for continued use. But I'll follow up with that on that to ensure that's the case here. Any other questions for Nick before we move over to Councilwoman Ortega's presentation?
Nick, did I see that there was progress on the Colfax BRT federal funding as well? Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that there was an announcement, authorization of federal funding for that. Now, of course, it still needs to be funded by Congress on there, but yes, Jake, thank you for that reminder. Good progress on that. And I can share, I think we have a press release on that as well. I'll put that in the chat as well.
Awesome. Congrats on both.
Thank you.
So to add on that one really quick, in addition to congressional appropriation, we actually have to submit the application, which has not been done yet. So, and then there's obviously a lot of preliminary activities that still need to be done, but largely that is something that's a very positive development, and definitely, as long as we continue through with the federal process, that will materialize.
Thanks for the clarification, Earl.
Are you telling us the federal government's going to give us money we didn't even apply for? I didn't.
They do it in many other places, so I don't see why not. So.
All right. Any other questions for Dick here? No. All right. With that then, thank you very much, Councilwoman Ortega, for joining us today. I'd introed earlier in the discussion that we're hoping to hear from you today about any new updates you've reviewed on your railway safety study that you've been completing in conjunction with a couple of our city departments. Our understanding preliminarily is that you've been working on both a study and also potentially some ordinance changes related to those studies. So would love to hear more about what you learned and what's next. With that, I'm not sure if you intended to actually share a presentation or just discuss. It could be that we need to have Nindy to help grant you some controls if you had a presentation to show. Oh, sorry, I believe you are muted.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Great.
Yes.
I do not have a presentation, and it's in part because we're still in the middle of our process. We had hoped to have everything completed by now. So today we moved to postpone any action on the ordinance that was originally drafted to April 25th. And that is to give us a little bit more time to talk with some of the property owner stakeholders that are along some of the freight corridors. And just to give a little context to this work, this goes back to starting the conversation in 2014. In 2016, the mayor convened a committee that was chaired by Chief Cade from the fire department. And the outcome of that was to have a voluntary program with development partners to, ask them to address the life safety issues. But there were no actual regulations for them to follow, nothing for the agencies to move forward for them to do. And so basically the upshot of all of that is we've been allowing construction, in some cases as close as 18 feet to the tracks. And if you have a derailment, a train car is typically 100 feet long. So we want to at least be addressing the life safety impact issues. We have no jurisdiction over the railroads, and we don't pretend to, but what we do control is land use. And so the HNTB study that has been underway is almost complete, and that will have recommendations that will provide options for the development community to be able to look at and pick and choose from to ensure that they are addressing life safety impacts of a development adjacent to rail. And so, for example, the River Mile and the Ball Arena people have already folded into their conceptual designs how they will address setting back part of their development to ensure that they're protecting the people who will be living and working in those structures, you know, at least in terms of the preliminary designs that we've seen. But the goal is to ultimately make sure that we are complying with Homeland Security in the work that they expect local government leaders to do, to identify our risks and vulnerabilities of all types, and to have mitigation measures in place. And that is what we are working toward. So my hope is by the 25th of April, we will not only have the complete study, but we will be able to be sharing some of the recommendations with those stakeholders and have some input, and more than likely we'll make changes to the ordinance that's been filed, and hopefully we'll have a new ordinance to replace that. And so I'm happy to keep you all posted, share a copy of that ordinance with you all if you want to see that, but we're taking the time to make sure that we've got that stakeholder input, and that may or may not shape some different changes to the draft ordinance. So that's really all of what it is in a nutshell. And it's ironic that it's timely that, you know, derailments have happened both here locally with RTD as recent as this week, and the couple incidents that have happened with Norfolk Southern, two in Ohio, and I think the other one was Nebraska, if I'm remembering correctly. So, you know, Denver's not been immune from these situations. You remember the train that tipped almost into the South Platte River this past summer. We've had other incidents that have occurred with hydrochloric acid and other things that required evacuations. And this is really making sure as a city, we're doing everything to be proactive in protecting human life as we continue to have these products come through our city. And one last thought is, when we planned out the Central Platte Valley, where the Central Main Line is, that these products come through, we did not have domestic drilling, and these petroleum tank cars were not prevalent like they are today. And if the Uinta Basin in Utah moves forward, we will have 200 train cars coming through our city on a daily basis. And so we need to be proactive in addressing this so that we are doing everything we can to not only protect human life, but all the infrastructure it's taken decades to build, especially down in the Central Platte Valley. So with that, let me stop, see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you. Yes. And first one from Lucia here.
Hi, Debbie. I just was wondering if there has been any progress, or if you know from the railroads for years, decades, they've been talking about rerouting the Central Line around the east side of the metro area. And I just remember that being talked about forever and ever. And then, if the Central Line was liberated because of that, that would help us get Front Range Rail right down the middle of the city, which would be awesome. Like,
right,
person moving people, not goods necessarily. So I don't know if you know anything more about that.
I've been part of some of the discussions. I would love to see Denver take the lead, working with neighboring jurisdictions to the north, to talk about what the benefits would be to those communities. Because if it just looks like Denver's giving them our problems, they're going to say no, thank you. But I think there could be some tremendous opportunities for them to get their food products, especially, to market. Some of them sell hay and other things. And so they could get their product to market much more quickly if they did it on train versus transporting by vehicles. And it would be cheaper as well. So I think part of it is, how do we really market that and then take advantage of these opportunities with the Buy Back Better program, or Build Back Better, I guess is what it's called. Biden's infrastructure dollars, to look at the possibility of moving that. But it really takes a point person in the city to spearhead that. And right now, I haven't seen that anybody has taken the lead within the city to do that. I think it's an important conversation to continue and to be having with some of the elected leaders through the Metro Mayor's Caucus, through CCI and other vehicles like CML, to just seriously begin that conversation. Because if you think about it, these train cars sit right in the center of our city for hours at a time, that stretch through the most populated area of downtown. And a breach of a petroleum tanker car could be catastrophic to our city.
Or any other hazmat material.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Jake.
Yeah, I had a question around really when considering, obviously there's the land use around the buildings, but considering that there are additional individuals, right, that are in the realm of Denver, particularly like at grade crossings, those are actually, there's actually not much distance between the drop down gates, right, and individuals, particularly thinking about like along 13th Avenue and or I think technically it's called Walnut at that point, but gets really weird and becomes the old Colfax around the Broncos stadium. And I know that I've been there when a train went by after a Broncos game, and it's like 20,000 people standing right there 5 feet away from a train. And wondering around the considerations that the city's taking around that, and then also to protect potential passenger rail with Burnham Yard properties, etc.
So the real bottom line is that this did include looking at the grade separations as well. There's a lot of information in the draft report that talks about grade separations. You all know, and many of you have been stuck at Santa Fe and Calumet trying to get north and south. That is a critical area that does tie into the Alameda underpass. A lot of that then ties into what happens at the Burnham Yard site and how some of that might impact Front Range Rail if it comes through that Burnham Yard site. So there's a lot of conversations happening around grade separations across the city, and looking at the possibility of whether, those become priority. Can we look at a package that looks at a multiple number of issues that we would want to see addressed in a grant application that we would submit to get 80% of those federal dollars to help solve some of these problems?
Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question.
Yeah, couple questions for me. I know you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that we don't have jurisdiction over the railroads, but we do have jurisdiction over our own land use. I'm wondering if you know of any, are there any realms in which we do have jurisdiction over the railroads and their activities, even if it's through our land use? I know we've talked about the surrounding land uses, but are there any requirements, restrictions, et cetera, that we are able to impose on the operations, development, et cetera, activities, staffing, et cetera, of the railroads as they cross through our city? Or is that not something that we have capacity, or sorry, not capacity, capability to do?
So it's really the federal government that oversees the railroads. And I think where local government could play a role, especially right now, is to be vocal. And I'm looking at trying to do a proclamation and try to get my colleagues on board that would address the braking system, which is part of what has caused some of the failures. This, in some cases, these braking systems haven't been upgraded in decades. And that is something that Congress is now talking about. It was actually a mandate under the Obama administration, and it was rolled back under the Trump administration. And, you know, I've seen engineers interviewed after the incident in East Palestine, Ohio, saying that we will continue to see these accidents all across the country until that issue with the braking systems gets addressed. So this is something where we can all, you know, community-wide be very vocal about how we're trying to solve some issues.
So
Okay.
to add on to that question, I think, you know, obviously railroads they spend more money in Washington on lobbyists, more so than many other industries. And the vast majority of their regulatory sort of framework is under either the STB, the Surface Transportation Board, or the Federal Railroad Administration. And I think that, you know, while the vast majority of that, of what is governing railroads is under those two, I think it might be worthwhile to look to see, have there been any sort of historical precedents with other communities with many of these types of efforts around the country, which I know there definitely have, in terms of getting the railroad to the table on a voluntary basis to address these things, even though they could have the power to say no and you couldn't do anything about it. And
So
so,
on a, I'm sorry, go ahead and finish. I was, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, on a case-by-case basis, we have worked with the railroads to address projects like one at a time, but system-wide, we're the only city actually undertaking something like this. And we had to look to Canada as a guide for what they did. And they had two different approaches. And one was very specific to properties along their freight corridors and had recommendations. That's very, very expensive to do. That is not what we did. We looked at the other methodology that just looked at the corridor and tried to identify a menu of options that could address the development adjacent to the tracks. And my hope is that when we're all done with this, that we would share this information with the National League of Cities Railroad Work Group so that they could take and use this, share it with other cities that are trying to deal with some of these same issues. And then collectively, through National League of Cities, they were all very vocal about to Congress about the need to address the braking systems, because these train cars travel all across the country. They don't stay just on tracks in these cities where these recent derailments have happened. And so it's important to protect the communities that happen to be parallel to where these tracks are at. Yes, it's important to move the commodity across the country, but at the same time, there should be some responsibility and accountability on behalf of the railroads who are making millions and millions of dollars. Issues like ensuring that train cars have more than one person on them. That's something their union has addressed with Congress when they were threatening to go on strike. So as you know, an elected leader, I have no problem using the bully pulpit to be vocal, and I have been. But this is where I think our communities can come together to say these are things we should be addressing for our city, and where we can impact Congress taking action, we should be vocal there as well.
Alan.
Thanks again for joining us, Councilwoman Ortega. Similar to Earl's question, I know you've been a advocate for safer streets in general in terms of traffic fatalities. And when we think about that, speed is so much of a factor. So to Earl's extent, have we used the bully pulpit or at least conversations with the UP or BNSF around maybe limiting some of their speeds, at least in the city of Denver, to see if they on a voluntary basis might help us with safety on that respect?
So typically when they're in an urban area, they have to slow down their speeds. I don't know if that's just in the downtown area. I'd have to look at that to see, for example, once they get out on the Santa Fe corridor, or if they're out on the Smith Road corridor, if they're able to pick up speeds as they get further away from highly impacted areas, but I assume because we are referred to as a high urban traffic area that they have to slow down their speeds. So I know anytime I've been downtown and they're traveling through our city, they move at a very slow pace. And, you know, it's when I've often been stuck waiting for the train to pass, like many of us have, right?
So back in the mid 2010s, when oil trains became a lot more common than they were prior to that, and there had been a few incidents around the country that brought, you know, more attention to oil trains. The increased amount of oil trains as a result of long delays associated with pipeline construction, because oil is going to move regardless, whether it's on a pipeline or a train.
Right.
And so I do know that as a result of that, of some, not necessarily, I don't think it was legislation, but I think it was just sort of voluntary efforts on the part of BNSF, where they proactively, particularly for oil trains, voluntarily, I think if it's within a certain mileage of a either a particular city or metro area where speed restricted trains are essentially started while they are going through said area. And so I think that that could be a precedent for other hazardous material types of trains to follow that same precedent. And so I think that there could be space for, I don't know whether there's gonna be appetite or not, but there could definitely be space for discussion on other commodities, that particularly ones that are hazardous and flammable and much more dangerous than some others.
Yeah, and it's my understanding when they're in a high urban traffic area, it doesn't matter what they're carrying, they need to slow down their speeds.
And I'm seeing one question in the chat from Gary Johnson. How much engagement with the Public Utilities Commission has there been?
On behalf of this process that we're working through, we have not engaged them. I'm not sure, you know, how much oversight they would have on the land use piece, which is a local government issue. That's the only thing we have jurisdiction over. And that's what we're trying to address in this process.
Gary, I'm wondering if you have any additional context on that question that you'd want to ask before we move on.
I appreciate that. I will tell you that I've been involved with the Public Utilities Commission on several occasions, and they have considerable control over railroad operations in Colorado. So I understand land use issues may be outside of their jurisdiction, but everything else is inside their jurisdiction. They're very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can look to incorporate. Again, the focus has been, how are we dealing with development adjacent to the tracks? I mean, I think the ideal situation would be to try to get the Central Main Line out of Denver. We'll still have local deliveries, but if we could remove the Central Main Line, that would solve the vast majority of these issues and challenges that we have in Denver. But, you know, it means then there would have to be some work with the folks that represent the communities to the north of here so that they understand there are some value and benefits to doing that. And then the $1 million question is, who pays for it? And that's where, you know, I was hopeful that we'd be taking a serious look through the opportunities available with the federal dollars still available through, you know, the Build Back Better funds.
I think that on that as well, I forgot to mention this point earlier, you know, with any sort of mainline relocation, you know, it might be worthwhile to go to sort of poach that question very lightly with the railroads on a voluntary basis first, because regardless of, you know, what work we do with, you know, adjacent communities, if the railroads aren't on board with it and it's something that's not mandated, then it's going to be, and if that doesn't come with just a tremendous amount of money that would be involved associated with that, then it's pretty much dead on deaf ears.
So in the work that we're doing, they have former railroad people And what we've been told over and over again is the railroads would probably love nothing more than to be able to do that because they can move their commodity across the country quicker. They don't have to slow down their speeds when they come through these high urban traffic areas, and they just won't pay for it. So that means somebody else has to submit an application and come up with the matching dollars for that to happen, but they would be the beneficiaries of it. So that's kind of where it's at. And I think why, it hasn't been moved as a project to try to come to fruition.
With that in mind, sorry, and this may be this may continue to be a jurisdictional issue, so forgive me. But I am curious about whether we could try to coordinate with the Front Range Rail Commission and see if there's an interest with that project to, it seems like they have a vested interest in also getting the trains off the Central Main Line in order to run to Union Station. And I wonder if that's a potential funding source. Not that the Front Range Rail is funded at all at this point, but maybe down the road.
There is some overlapping conversations of the different parties that are working on these different pieces. So you have Front Range Rail, you've got Burnham Yards, you've got this HNTB study, which ironically could be very foundational to accessing federal dollars within the city of Denver. You probably have to have a different engineering study done to look at the new reroute corridor. Obviously some input from the PUC on that as well, but at this point in time, the focus that we have had has been around just what we have jurisdiction over, because I think trying to take on relocating the tracks is going to involve bringing together a lot of different players to be successful in finding the matching monies, making sure the railroads are on board, to trying to get the neighboring jurisdictions on board as well. And then again, you'll still have local deliveries because there are businesses across our city that rely on some of these products to be delivered to them. So you'll still have some of these railroad spurs through our city, just not the main, central line with all the volume of traffic that currently comes through here today.
So I do have a question, but I see Earl, your hand's still up. Is that old or?
It's still, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, no, great. So wondering about, it's something you mentioned early on, some of the next steps and delays or more time for the report here. You mentioned something, a date in late April, I think it was. Is that
right.
intended for the conclusion of this report, or is it the next stage of a council ordinance?
So the anticipation is the report should be completed very, very soon. And it's some of the recommendations in the report that we want to be reviewing with the stakeholders, and then look to see how any of that shapes any changes to the current draft ordinance that we have. And the hope is that we have time between now and that time frame to pull that input together and look at what kind of changes need to be made, either as amendments or in filing a new bill to replace what's there. And the real bottom line is the ordinance simply gives authority to the agencies to ensure that they're addressing this issue with the developers, and it would give the developers options to choose from that have come out of this report.
Awesome. And so I think something asked, I think earlier was, how can we, and I guess the public watching, see this report at any future time when it's done? I think a lot of us here would be interested in, what you learned from Canada, what you learned from elsewhere, what the recommendations were. And I know it's like inherently tied to the ordinance, but I mean, they're probably not a one for one. Yeah.
The hope and anticipation is that we would file the report. It would be on the City Council Granica system that anybody could access. Anybody who wants a copy, once it's finalized, could reach out to my office and we'd be happy to get you a copy. The one thing that they're looking at to make sure of is that we're not providing any detailed information on commodity flow, times, products, hours of them driving, coming through our city. because it becomes a safety issue, and typically it's only aggregate data. So we're looking to make sure that, you know, those kinds of things are not in the report, because you don't want to further compromise our city.
Mhm. Okay, with that, any final questions for Councilwoman Ortega? Oh, Jake, yep, see your hand.
Mine's more of a comment, but with that, in addition to the report, Councilperson Ortega, if you or your office finds anything that is particular note for this board, will you deliver action items to us? I think we'd have an interest in stepping up if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one other thing I think is important is when we have the ordinance brought forward, it would be really helpful to have, you know, people from the advisory board talking to your council members, saying why you think this is important for the city to be doing to address the safety. I mean, the real bottom line for me is I want this all to be preventative. I never want to have our city be in a situation like East Palestine, because we are so much more populated, and it took us over 30 years to build out the infrastructure we have in the Central Platte Valley, and that includes our RTD tracks. And I never want to see any of that impacted with an incident that could happen in our most populated area where these train cars come through.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks for giving me time, and we'll keep you posted, okay?
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, and right on time here, it's time for us to move on to our sidewalks ordinance update. I believe, Nick, we had you listed as leading this part. Is that still true? Yes. All
It
right.
is, yes,
Well,
if I can get unmuted on there. So thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, I'm going to give kind of a brief update and next steps on where we are with the Citizen Initiative 307, or Denver Deserves Sidewalks. I think probably, as most folks on this board are aware and remember, this was a citizen initiative that passed on our November 2022 ballot on there. It creates a fee based on the linear feet of right-of-way in front of public and private property. That is all property throughout the city, with the exception of the airport on there, which was explicitly accepted into the ordinance on there. The fee revenue, of course, goes towards building sidewalks where there are no current sidewalks exist. And also goes to bringing existing sidewalk up to standard. And this can mean repairing damaged sidewalks, or I think most folks are familiar with the Hollywood sidewalks, which are the very narrow sidewalks, if you can call them that, that are just next to a curb on there, and certainly are not the current city standard for sidewalks on there. So this initiative, and I'll stop calling it an initiative because it's an ordinance now, it places the responsibility for maintenance of all those sidewalks on the city, as opposed to previously that maintenance for repairing a sidewalk and in times bringing up to a standard was the responsibility of the adjacent property owner on there. One important clarification on that as we approach our snowiest month of the year: this ordinance does not change the responsibility for residents and adjacent property owners to clear snow and debris from the sidewalk. So the maintenance, the city's maintenance responsibility, think of it as kind of the concrete work that's involved in that, but residents will still be responsible for complying with rules about removing snow. We heard quite a bit about that at our last meeting. The ordinance requires the creation of an enterprise fund for collection and management of fee revenue. And enterprise fund is, without getting out over my skis on kind of financial lingo on this, wastewater is, our wastewater fee goes into a enterprise fund. And basically it is a place to collect that revenue, and also allows you to bond against that revenue and the anticipation of future revenue on there. And that is an important element of making sure that we have adequate funding to implement the ordinance. So, okay, since we passed in November, the DOTI team, in collaboration with our partners in Department of Finance, City Attorney's Office, Parks and Recreation, certainly Forestry, have been working to both kind of start to develop an implementation plan, but also identify things that may be either challenging or we may not be able to implement, either from an operational standpoint, from a financial standpoint on that. And that will then kind of lead into what our next phase is going to be, and I'll talk about it here in a sec, is our stakeholder engagement process, which would then lead into potentially an amendment process through City Council on there. DOTI, as I mentioned, is going to lead a stakeholder engagement process. Expectation is that will then produce recommendations for potential amendments to the ordinance. City Council ultimately is the only one that has the authority to amend this. So ideas now are great, but they are not amendments until City Council says they are amendments on that. And with an initiated ordinance, we have to wait at least 6 months from the date of passage before we can amend. Basically, that puts us at May. So kind of with that expectation, we are targeting a stakeholder group of approximately 15 to 20 folks, really looking for a diversity of perspectives. We want folks that are excited and gung-ho about this, folks that are concerned, folks that bring perspectives that maybe we haven't considered up until this point, and even the proponents haven't considered up until this point, with the goal of really making this, staying true to kind of what the voters approved, but something that can be implemented and implemented successfully and really meet as many or as all of the goals that I think we all want to meet as far as building out our multimodal system on this. I'd like to request this advisory group discuss and potentially nominate maybe 2 to 5 of your members to serve on that stakeholder group, and we'll keep as many seats for y'all as possible, or that you all request on this. But with the same request, I think we've got a good diversity of perspectives on this board, and so I would just request that the folks you send over there reflect that good diversity out there. We are anticipating that meeting kicking off in April, and the process, I think could last anywhere from 1 to 3 months, depending on how deep into detail and into the weeds we get in that. I think we could go to the center of the earth if we wanted to on there, but really, the expectation is to, in a timely manner, let's get some potential amendment recommendations to our City Council partners in order to kind of keep this process going and keep this program moving forward on this. We are going to distribute a dedicated email for submissions for you to share with your networks as well. And I would have shared that today, but I tested it and it is broken already on there. So I'm going to work with our TS team to make sure that is up and running, because there would be nothing worse than to put that out there and everyone is getting bounce backs on there. That is basically the update I wanted to provide. So basically, high points is we will be opening next week. We will send out a press release with kind of where to submit applications to serve on this. We'll be working closely with proponents, and we also anticipate working closely with the advisory board as we go through this process on there. And then finally, of course, the request for, I'd love to see, maybe 2 to 5 members from this advisory board, depending on what you guys think, to be nominated to participate in that. We'll also be talking to some of our other advisory committees, likely specifically the Pedestrian Advisory Committee, Mayor's Pedestrian Advisory Committee, to send someone as well on there. I know there's a lot of questions around this. I'm going to stop here and happy to discuss and answer anything I know and can tell you at this point.
All right, how about first? So quick question about some of the submission process you just talked about there. You mentioned you were putting an email together. I assume that means there's some sort of application required, resume, bio, something along those lines. And we are seeking people not just from, say, this advisory board and MPAC, but just members of the general public can all apply as well.
Correct. Yep, absolutely correct. Like I said, I want to make sure that we save some spots for the advisory board. I think this group will provide some very good insight and kind of your knowledge. But yeah, we do, like I said, wanting that diversity of perspectives, want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate. And yes, to your initial point, yes, it will be probably a stripped down version of the application process y'all went through when applying for this committee. Want to keep it relatively simple, want to keep this moving as quickly as possible, but think of a similar kind of process.
Okay. And following on that question, you mentioned probably looking at 15 to 20 persons for the entire committee. I'm assuming that means a couple of the council persons who might help draft the amendment. You mentioned a representative or two from the Mayor's Pedestrian Advisory Committee, maybe 2 to 5 reserved for us, and room for the public. Are there any spots being reserved for either the signatories of the ordinance, those who actually got the ordinance on, or the campaign committee that I think ran it generally?
Yeah, certainly. So Joel Noble has already reached out, and Jonathan, I know you were participating in that on that. So certainly, yes, we will be working very closely with them to both select the members and then participate on it. Of course, we don't want it to be all. I think we've got a pretty good idea of the ordinance reflects, I would assume reflects kind of that perspective on that. And so kind of going back to that diversity perspectives, want to make sure that it is broader than that, but absolutely the proponents, we anticipate the proponents having a very strong role in this.
And that's actually exactly why I sort of brought it up, but with the numbers there, I was almost worried we might have too many proponents and no room left for those that aren't. But also recognize that it'd be super valuable to have the perspective of those who were.
Absolutely.
So
yeah. And if we end up getting 23, 25 great ones, there's nothing in charter says what we limit. What I don't want is 150. And if that's the case, it's going to be a more than a 3-month process on there. So we want to keep it to a manageable amount. But again, we want to make sure that the proponents are there represented, as well as the advisory boards and other folks, and then the general public.
Okay, great. Thanks. Alan.
Yeah, Nick, any insights to when the fee will start to be collected?
We are working feverishly with that because, of course, what funds this program is the fee. So it is very much a chicken and egg right now on that. Expectation at this point is that this will take place probably in the latter half of this year. That is also a very complex process. One of those things very similar to sidewalks, where on its face seems very simple, just add another line into the wastewater bill, but in practice is a very complicated thing. Now we have experience, we know how to do it. It takes a second, but just want to make sure that we've got that all smoothly. We've got a lot of experience now having come through the volume-based trash pricing, that and a lot of lessons learned from that. But I would anticipate the latter part of this year. It's also a balance of, well, what if the amendment process results in some changes to rate? All random. This is on that. If it changes it, depending on how it changes it, would that change the fee? But like I said, we need to get that fee revenue coming in order to really start to implement this program.
And then the $64,000 question, clearly this is a wild guesstimate, but when do you think Denver residents might see either repairs to sidewalks or new sidewalks going in? And I recognize there's a lot of variables based on what comes out of this committee and when the fee starts being collected and things like that.
Yes. I don't want to say a date, but the first step, and you will see actually in City Council here in the coming weeks, is a contract amendment that with an existing kind of we've been working on for a number of years now, an inventory of all of the city's assets. And when I say assets, I mean everything from, signal poles, signs, things like that. This was also originally anticipated to include sidewalks, not to the level that we would need to implement this program. And so this contract extension coming through will get us started on, so we will add about $50,000 to get us the level of detail we need to understand the condition of sidewalks, down to a granular level that allows us to prioritize the order in which we start repairing those sidewalks on there. And so that's what you're going to see first. And if you go into the ordinance, really what it assumes is the early period will be the I forget the language now, but developing the plan, the needs assessment and the plan on that. So that's where it's going to start. So the work won't be immediate upon catching the fee out there, but it will, that work and that the analysis and the plan is what really allows this to move forward efficiently.
And last question, I'll make it brief. I'm assuming equity will be considered as
Yes.
you all decide which neighborhoods to roll this out to first.
Yes, yes.
Great.
And, I would anticipate, of course, we had the neighborhood sidewalk repair program started a few years ago, actually maybe more than a few now on there. And, we had done a fair amount of work, not to, again, to the granular level that this will require on there, but certainly prioritizing that, how we do that, how, where's the highest level of need and being driven by that.
Thank you.
I had a question. I think it's a follow-on Alan's series of thoughts. I guess in addition to the fee, for the current sidewalk system, between now and implementation, how is that being handled when reports come in? Is that now the city's going out and fixing those in the interim, or I guess I don't know how the temporary version of this looks.
Sure. So, and that's one of the things, that we have to change that process a little bit because of this. And we've been trying to figure out on that, but no, repairs would continue, but not with a charge to the residents.
Okay. I think as a neighborhood with maybe some of the highest level of complaints in Cap Hill, I can imagine, particularly there's some, I'm sure this has not been fun for Earl, but there's some runners that I've seen trip that are probably very excited that some of the bumps in the sidewalks might get ironed out.
We can't have Earl getting injured. That is so true, Jake. It's too
Runners are pretty good at not watching where they're going, so maybe it's their own fault.
All right, a true Vision Zero approach.
Well, thanks, Nick. I'm wondering, any other final questions from the group? If not, I think what I'll propose for us doing nominations here, I'm not going to take the time now. I'll send out an email following this meeting, likely tomorrow, wherein folks can self-nominate or nominate each other for folks. I'm assuming primarily self-nominations here, as it is a commitment of additional time beyond this. For anyone who might be interested in joining that committee, we can discuss largely offline as a group and define a path forward from there.
Real quick, Nick, one more question, just that I think might affect nominations. How often do you expect this task force or committee to meet?
And that's going to depend on kind of ultimately the full size of it, but I would anticipate initially maybe a bi-weekly schedule, meaning once every 2 weeks, not twice every week, once every 2 weeks on that. And, based on kind of the progress we're able to make initially, letting that guide kind of the future meeting cadence. We don't want to overwhelm it, but certainly we want to move with urgency.
And I'll go for Aileen too, because I know she's having microphone issues. And on Zoom, question mark?
Well, we may have to do Teams, but no, certainly would offer a virtual option. Yeah.
Sweet, thanks, Nick.
Great. All right, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much for the update. I'm excited to see this moving forward. Next up on the agenda, the 2024 budget. I know Earl is with us today, back from his big trip, to tell us what's going on here. For those who are watching and haven't been getting emails about internal coordination, we intend to be reserving a lot of time in our April meeting to work through budgetary topics. We're hoping today can be a kickoff of sorts, an introduction to perhaps not whether or not we can accomplish anything today on the budget, what we should be looking forward to, material, documentation-wise, activity-wise, what should we be planning for, and how will we and our communities be involved in this budget review process? With that, Earl, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I think that, I guess to start this off really, Given that, we are in a transition year and we are, I guess, to some degree, particularly in the back half of the year, dealing with a great deal of economic uncertainty. We're also dealing to some degree, and this is as a city as a whole, with sort of the longer term migrant response associated with the efforts that we've been engaged in here in the last few months. And so this year really is going to be an interesting budget year on many fronts. And so one thing that I've been really preaching quite a bit is how can we best control what we can control to put forth a budget proposal that reflects our priorities and the community's priorities, while also, trying to make headway on some of the longer term initiatives, whether it be DME or some other things to really lay the groundwork for a strong and sustainable budget going forward beyond the next budget year, right? And so, I think one of the biggest things and best ways we can do that when it comes to requests and submissions and everything, the greater the justification, the greater the facts that we can use to support those efforts, the more successful we'll be. And so that's what we've been sort of preaching to the department here on, that, as well as, the impact of things not being funded and really being able to articulate a clear message around that. And so I think that preliminarily, I think with this particular group here, really any sort of, continuing of letters of support for key initiatives and projects would be important, and really sort of outlining memo forms similar to what you did last year, what your proposed priorities would be for the upcoming budget year. So I think those are kind of the two big things, probably starting with the letters of priorities to have sometime over the next maybe 2 months. I think that one of the things that we've done, particularly internally here within DOTI over the last, we're really starting this year, was providing more of a runway for our teams to really work through, budget requests, the priorities, and sort of doing a lot of good quality upfront work to make sure we're putting the best foot forward in our request to the Department of Finance. And so Department of Finance particularly, they are working over the coming weeks to really establish deadlines and tasks and activities that hopefully to some degree we'll be able to have something to share for you, like at the next meeting. And I think that there could probably be a little bit of each of the subsequent meetings here to discuss this in a little bit more as we receive information, particularly with this being sort of an abnormal year in many ways, communicating out what we can accordingly. So hopefully to some degree that answers your question. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain.
Well, like I said, I might have a few around the process. I know we might want to discuss the letter that the Finance and Budget Committee sent out recently and any response to that. But I think on the topic you brought up here of priorities from the group, I know something that's been discussed a lot on the board within the board is difficulty in doing so because we don't know what options are on the table to some extent. I know we have DME coming forward soon, and that will help because those are some major capital improvement projects, or it includes many major capital improvement projects. But I think what we don't have really is a framework within which to comment. We know that there's operational budgets for stormwater, there's operational budgets for this, there's existing projects that funding is committed for. You know better than anyone else how complicated the department's budget is. So understanding what's already been committed, what's previously been promised in one way or another, the scale of different projects, and to allow us to say, I suppose, just give us something to react to, as opposed to just giving you generic feedback that might not be as helpful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can work towards for the next meeting, determine what that looks like internally first, and then working towards trying to have that for the next meeting. I think in general, one of the two of the big areas for next year, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but really just how do we bring DME to life in terms of our strategic transportation plan and what the best way to do that is. And then 2, how do we, more assertively and forcefully address state of good repair of assets, and really sort of making that, because obviously that's kind of core to what we do in being an asset owner. And then I think beyond that, there's a few other things, but I think those are kind of the big heavy hitters. And then anything that has sort of publicly known funding gaps, really working to address making those whole as well, to bring those projects to further along and into completion as needed. So. But I think back to my original point, figuring out what that level of detail that probably could be useful to you for helping you draft that list of priorities. I'll work with Nick and we'll determine what we can share to really help you help us, essentially.
Okay. And there are sort of some subcomponents to that request. I think part of it is I know we wanted to reserve a lot of time in April for budget work, given that we know that it's an important period for the budget. I think it would be helpful for the group if we just had a sense of what that, say we held an hour for it. What would that hour look like? What is it we can prepare for? Is there documentation we need to review? Are there lists we need to review that we can preliminarily opine on so that we can make good use of it? We use use of that time in the meeting, in part to make sure we don't reserve a long time and find that there's very little input for us to give at that time.
Okay, yeah, I think that, well, like I said, we'll work with Nick, or I'll work with Nick, and we'll determine what that looks like. And we'll, at our interim planning meeting that we have in between these meetings, we'll work to shore that up and try and address that.
Okay. Questions from the rest of the group here? No, okay, so this one might be a little bit too specific, but one thing I had been wondering, and this to help me with a frame of what to look forward to. We had a discussion a couple months ago about the transportation improvement program through DRCOG and the various applications that we sent for those STBG and AQMM grants. We noted in that process that there were a number of items placed on Denver's request wait list. The reason being that there were other avenues to acquire that funding besides DRCOG grants, TIP grants, particularly CIP funding, capital improvement program funding, where we saw items being waitlisted for DRCOG requests because they were qualified as something that could receive other funding, particularly STIP funding. Should we be considering those to be high priority projects to request within this year's budget, or are those fully untethered?
Nick, I don't know what, one, I'm not sure which projects were in reference, but also what I guess you said the whole process with DRCOG and what that entails and what sort of are the parameters and guardrails around that.
Sure. And Jonathan, if I'm correcting, or if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying those ones that are on the wait list, should we assume that for 2024, those will be a priority? Is that just so I'm clear?
That's the core of the question. It was only some items had this designation of, well, we're not request from DRCOG because we think we can get it from SIP funding.
Right.
But we should take that to mean we think we can do that presently with SIP funding, or if it's more of a kick the can to, someday it could be SIP funding.
I think it depends on the project on that, but yes, I think you should assume if it went that far and ultimately was waitlisted, that yes, it would be anticipated for CIP funding or another form of funding. I think even one of those sidewalk funding specifically on there. But we could get, I think for April, we could definitely get into the specifics of kind of where we see those from a timeline trends standpoint. Fitting in, because of course the TIP is different than our annual budget because it's a multi-year budget on there. But yeah, I think we could drill into that a little bit for the group for the April meeting, certainly.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't know how to frame those as we look ahead. And I know we'll have a lot more information. It sounds like we'll have a lot more information available by April, given your update on Denver Moves Everyone earlier. You said that the DME process should be further along by then, and we should be looking at projects from DME in part. So hopefully those timelines coalesce. Alan, I'm seeing you have a question.
Yeah, question got just really wanted to echo what Jonathan said, Earl and Nick. We'd love to provide more specific feedback. I think a lot of the board is really craving, even if we can't say, you know, specific projects or see maybe a bigger scope of what kind of conversations we can have. So as opposed to more broad feedback with the letter, we can provide more specific feedback, and just a general charge to you all is what kind of specific feedback are you looking for us? In general, I think the board would really value the ability to give some more input. So thank you guys so much as you think about that.
Absolutely. You know, and we've talked previously about some of the challenges are ultimately this is Mayor Hancock's budget, and then, you know, what will be subsequent mayor's budgets that aren't public. And so it puts us in kind of this weird position. But your focus on what can the board do to advise, as is laid out in the charter, and be, you know, really have some productive, fruitful conversations on this. I think we've heard that loud and clear, and Earl and I'll focus on that for the April presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions on budget here? No. Okay, in that case, thank you, Earl, for the preview. Next segment of our agenda here is committee report outs. I know we've had some work done by both the Finance and Budget Committee and perhaps also the Policy and Operations Committee in the last month. So I figure we can take this time for as an opportunity to not only report on what was discussed there, but potentially hold time for any further follow-up with this larger group, questions for us that came out of your committees, areas we might like to deliberate or decide on. Wondering if either the Policy and Ops or Finance and Budget would like to go first.
I can go. This is Jamie Lewis from the Ops. Quite an agenda today. Most of the things we've been discussing over the last few months included the implementation of the sidewalk ordinance and participating more in the budget process. So kudos to you guys for finally getting this on the agenda. I really appreciate it. Besides that, tomorrow we have our meeting, and we'll probably discuss further details about this railroad issue that Ortega brought up, and also maybe talk about selection to the sidewalk was it the engagement? The stakeholder engagement process for the sidewalks. So I did miss our last meeting, so if any other of my members want to speak up, but pretty much that's where we're at.
Okay, and it sounds like nothing new for our broader group to deliberate, approve, or take on to the larger body here. Is that right?
Well, I'd like to dig a little deeper into more of a comprehensive oversight of the railroad. You know, she was mentioning the easements, and that's something that needs to be done immediately because of the Barnum Yards and other projects. But
Sure. Sorry, for clarification, I meant nothing came out of your committee that you were saying, "Hey, we're looking for approval from the larger group," or
no, we're good. We're good.
To follow up on there. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And for Finance and Budget, I think everyone on this line is probably aware of some of the work you did in the last month, but wondering if we could get a quick report out on that just for sake of the public that could be viewing.
Yeah, really, Gary and I met talking about a letter to send to the DOTI Advisory Board. I'll post the link to that letter here as well if anyone hasn't had a chance to read it, but the group should have gotten an email on this already. But the gist of it is kind of what I just asked for Nick, just kind of more formalizing it here in a auditory way, but you know, wanting to understand a little bit more about and Earl too, not just Nick, but wanting to get more specific input in the process. What are priorities for discretionary spending? Can we get a list of a menu of all the projects that will be considered over the next decade or so we can understand kind of what the city is contemplating, and we recognize that we can't, have specific input into the budget because of the confidential nature of it, but wanted to get more specific input on prioritizing project programs or other discretionary funding that the board might be able to advise on. And then we also mentioned at a future date, we'd like to, not necessarily in this budget cycle because it's for not as pressing, but would love to understand kind of where things are with the current Go Bond implementation and how things are moving along there in terms of projects that have been funded or in the queue. But yeah, it was a good conversation. So again, Gary, thanks for joining that.
Great, and I'm sure a lot more to come in the coming couple of months here. As we have documents to dive into.
Yeah, and we'll be looking to probably meet here, if not this month, certainly next month, as we get a little bit closer to that, to craft out more of a letter that we'd like to put together of general priorities that we as a board have. So I welcome not just anyone on the budget committee, but anyone from this group. I'll put out a call for that when we have that meeting scheduled. And please feel welcome to give input over email, carrier pigeons, Slack, any way that you have, so we can craft that letter to make sure that everyone here has input in crafting this letter of what we're prioritizing to DOTI.
Great. All right, with that, we can move on to our action items list. For those of you who may not have been at our last meeting, Jake introduced a new concept here, which is that we would draft an action items list for each of our meetings to make sure that items we said we would follow up on actually got attended to, had an owner and someone and sort of tasked to attend to, instead of the things getting lost meeting for meeting. So I want to take a moment to complete a quick review of the updates from, or the action items list from last meeting and where we've made progress so far. To begin with, we'd had concerns raised by Joe and also a few other community members that have spoken to us at the board, members of the public that have spoken to us before, about safety issues on our 13th and 14th Avenue one-ways, primarily in District 5, but also outside of District 5. There's been a lot of consternation over rollover crashes, houses being hit, a lot of high speeding, difficulties crossing these one-ways. So there's an open question, it's hit the news and other locations as well about, what do we do about this? Is anyone doing anything about this? Is the department looking at this, et cetera, et cetera? Joe kindly offered to follow up on this, but wanted to, I would say the status update here is sort of an interim hold to some extent. Councilwoman Sawyer, as well as other representatives from the department, are holding an open house on this very topic. But I think it happens to be occurring tomorrow, right?
That is correct. Yes, it's tomorrow evening. And if anybody wants a link, I can give it to them. It'll be a virtual meeting, and all the citizenry is invited. So expect to get a few answers from that meeting. Yes.
Awesome. So we'll look to some more answers, maybe perhaps a brief report out on what you learned there in our next meeting, but not as much to answer today.
Correct. Yeah.
A next item on the list then, raised by a few of our public commenters and specifically Julie Reiskin as well. I know Julie is out at this moment. She was unable to attend today, so I can report out on her behalf. We reported an issue with 311 tickets requiring an exact address in many cases. The functionality does prompt you to say, hey, you can put in an intersection, you can put in some sort of mid-block locations, which is really helpful for not only certain types of parking issues, but also sometimes just how and where people see properties or incidents. I know in some cases it's very unclear whether a certain sidewalk that might have snow on it or ice on it belongs to one property or another. So it might be easier to call it an intersection. Same can be true for cars if they're parked in front of sidewalks. It's hard to report with an exact address when you don't know where you are to some extent, but you might have an intersection or other sort of map-based location. We did have someone from the department reach out to Julie to discuss. They had a first meeting last Friday and some very optimistic news to report here. It looks like Pocket Gov is going to be working through sort of an IT department, a technical integration, a migration a little bit later this, I think it's early winter, something along those lines. So intention is that with this migration to the city website, this problem should be fixed. Apparently, this is a matter of like different databases that can't speak together well, can't be tracked, can't be followed up. So I know this is a bit far away next winter when we're exiting winter now for a solution, but it looks like the problem has been recognized. I'm not sure, unfortunately, I was not on the meeting. This is just what Julie emailed out to me. I'm not sure if they're planning to have a follow-up meeting to discuss any further concerns along these lines. But they've addressed at least in part of it, or if not in whole. I'll flag this for Julie if she's on next month to see if there's anything else she learned in this conversation. Any questions on these first two reports before moving on to the next action item?
I had a point of clarification, Jonathan. When you mentioned early winter, is that 2023 or 2024?
I believe that's 2023.
Okay.
Yep. So not now, but by later this year, but most of the year away from now.
Okay, got it. That was helpful.
Yes. Thanks. Don't see anyone else. So last item was actually I was meant to follow up on with Nick and failed to do so here. We did have a few public commenters as well as members of this group bring up that there's numerous 311 violations that have come up that have been closed out with a response of no violation when there are actually still violations, such as utility permit issues, fences in the right of way, things like this. And the conclusion from our last meeting was that Nick would give some thought as to who to bring this one to, and I never followed up with you, Nick, on that. So my apologies. Don't mean to put you on the spot here, just flagging that this is still on the list. Yep. So I will follow up with you on it after. Yeah.
And the same gentleman that met with Julie, I'm going to point you right back to him.
Oh,
he is, yeah, Mr. Como is doing great work. He's one of our newer employees, but is doing some almost concierge work for the department with 311 to make sure we're effectively responding to those. So, yep, well, he was good, and I'll go right back to that well.
All right, great. So those were the three items from our last action list, most of which are, in progress in some form, if not actually closed out as Julie's might be. For today, wondering if we have any new action items to add to the list. I can, of course, raise one, which was Matt Charlie's commentary from earlier today. But before diving into that one, wondering if anyone else has items to add.
I think it's something we got to figure out format wise, whether we want to include things like this, but obviously we have the action item to do the nomination process for the sidewalk stakeholder group. Yep,
good idea. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think that's valuable to add because ultimately we're looking for owners of these items. And I've already offered, so I will just note that I will be following up on that one by email for this group. Anyone else, other items?
I don't mean this to be all me, but I believe that Jamie also accepted the policy committee taking on a look at the railway safety.
And I think more specifically, that's the committee looking at it once the report is finished or we have something to look at.
That's a good call out. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else? All right, returning to our public commenter from today, Matt Charlie. So obviously he's been working with someone from the department already and has said he's been a good partner, but is still a bit frustrated in that it seems like no solutions they've come to the table with yet have worked and have been sort of enduring. I feel like what this might require is just someone sort of raising a hand to dive in a little bit further on the history of what's been reported, what's been tried, and what Juan and Matt think might be options next to figure out what could be done, if anything. I know to some extent, you know, individuals making bad choices such as parking in front of driveways is what it is. Can't always stop it forever, but we would love to better understand what's been tried and if there's any other creative solutions that the department could help pursue with Matt, even if not this department, so someone else. I'm wondering if anyone here would be willing to raise a hand and dive into that a little bit further with Matt and Juan. Oh, Nick's doing it. Nick, oh my goodness. As if your agenda is not full enough.
Yeah, I can connect with Juan and get the history on it and yeah, see what we can come up with. Can't promise I can fix it by next month, but certainly know Juan well and yeah, happy to connect with him.
I guess feel free to loop me into that conversation
Yeah.
as needed, because of course we'd love to have a report back for the group here. Recognizing that there may not be a solution, as I said. I mean, like eventually you can put as much signage as you want, but people continue to park there, they'll continue to park there to some extent, or it might not be this department that can do anything. So regardless of whether we can find a satisfactory conclusion or an optimal conclusion, would be good for us all to know what it is and where we're going.
Great. Yep, happy to.
Awesome. Alan.
I think it brings up an interesting point, is certainly not for April or necessarily even May, but it might be an interesting conversation about how do we, as a city, prioritize right-of-way enforcement with little Jeeps going around deciding like, hey, is it based mostly on, we're looking for furthering commerce by making sure meters are turned over? Are we looking at safety around bike lanes and sidewalks being clear and things like that? So that could be just throwing that out there for a potential future conversation, Jonathan. Thanks.
Good idea. And it relates to something else we'd previously raised. So I think we can try to combine some of those topics. Paul.
I'm on Zoom from a library, so I'm going to keep my talking voice kind of low. I hope you all can hear me. Don't want to be that guy. I've had some conversations offline of the group with Michelle and reached out to some folks at DOTI about right-of-way enforcement. And that was a great tangent into it in terms of we all know which neighborhoods the city prioritizes. I know we're not exactly drowning in enforcement drivers or extra vehicles to do enforcement, but I do feel some of these neighborhoods on the periphery of where Denver goes from urban to suburban get left out in the process. And for those, it's less an issue of ticket enforcement and revenue opportunities and more an issue of people blocking sidewalk ramps for handicap and elderly and pedestrian access and blocking driveways or encroaching on them bit by bit. And, if there's no enforcement mechanism, we know they won't really adhere to that. So, in the spirit of leading with the carrot and following with the rod, if there was some sort of look at sending right-of-way enforcement out into sort of those slightly more peripheral neighborhoods, I know we see it in University Park, removed about 14 blocks from DU. It would just be a great topic at a future point, potentially.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the additional context on what you've been investigating here. This rounds off a few topics related to right-of-way enforcement that we broached, but haven't dived into or looked to in these coming months, given the budget considerations. But I'll put this on our list for the agenda drafting that we do every month to see if we can bring this up shortly. All right. So typically odds and ends here, we take a look at what's coming next on the agenda. I've already mentioned it for the most part. We're going to look at the budget really heavily. Most of our time will be reserved for budget discussions next month. We do want to hold a little bit of time for an update on I-25 and Broadway. I know Nick gave a very brief update a meeting ago about the press release that had come out that day. We did, for sake of time today, bump that topic because we were worried we couldn't get into it deeply enough with the breadth of topics we were already covering, but we don't want to ignore it either. So we'll have a discussion about what changed in that project so far and what's to come next for it. Some of that detail you can, of course, find in the press release, but I thought we'd hold time for discussion of it. Beyond that, some of these topics like right-of-way enforcement is what we'll be looking to in the near future, following our April meeting. We'll of course keep this group up to date as we look to develop additional threads of conversation. With that, we're about a conclusion, but we're quite early today, given some of our topics ran under time. Wondering, it being odds and ends, anything else folks would like to raise, either suggestions for future meeting topics, concerns you're hearing from your neighborhood, anything else we might have missed in the course of a typical agenda? Jake.
Yeah, this probably potentially made sense as the during the executive report. But I know that the Colorado Department of Revenue put out a pretty well, I think it was actually humorous, some of the language they used yesterday, but around license plate registrations, particularly from other states and a recent state law that passed. My understanding is that right-of-way enforcement is a body responsible for checking that. And I believe, unless I'm mistaken, there's actually a huge revenue implication for the county, city and county of Denver out of those registration fees if effective. Was curious, Nick or Earl or both of you, whether that had been considered, how we might approach that both from an enforcement and then secondarily from a potential windfall in net new registrations.
Yeah, Jake, I can take that. So I'm aware of kind of that initiative. I have not gone through it with our right-of-way enforcement team, but you know, certainly will as a part of that process on there. And I bet I could do an update on that in April as well.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I think for anyone that missed it, the state actually has a law now saying that if you move here and don't register your car within the time period required by the state, you actually have to pay the back taxes, or I guess it's back fees on the registration to the date you move to Colorado or to the date you let your registrations expire, which having seen a few cars in my neighborhood, there's probably a 5 to 10 year registration fee from certain individuals that could be coming to the department if enforced, which is a lot of cash.
I just remembered, this is Joe. I had one thing. I talked to Pete Piccolo of Bicycle Colorado, and he said that they were trying to get some legislation passed that will take away some of the state's authority over vehicle enforcement, the red light enforcement and things like that. So that's coming before the state capitol, and it should be good, and we should support them in that. But they're really trying to relax all those, not all, but many of the rules. Like you can only do certain things at certain times, and you have to have 2 people in the vehicle or 1 person in the vehicle. So that is going before the State House. So I don't know if anybody's following that, but it sounds like it's a direction that we wanted to go also. So just a little information there.
Yeah, Joe, I think unfortunately, I think you were out the month we did this a couple months ago, but Ted Porras and David Giacomo came and presented about the current state of the safety cameras here in Denver. We were referenced that this potential legal change might be coming in the state legislative session. My understanding is they're going to introduce that bill relatively late in session, so I don't think that it's out there yet for us to review, but I know I, for one, am looking to support, and then we should probably keep discussing within this group as it comes forward.
Okay, yeah. I was there. I think I had a problem with my phone, but yeah, I heard that. And
okay.
Yeah. So anyway, Bicycle Colorado is going to be representing that too. So when it comes out, yeah, if I hear anything more, I'll get back to the group.
Awesome.
That should be an interesting development. I feel like every other car in my neighborhood is a license plate from another state.
Anyone else? Neighborhood updates? Hearing none, looks like we can wrap a little bit early today. Thanks for joining, everyone, and we'll see you next month.
Adios.
Bye. Thank you for a wonderful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.